The water came on Tuesdays and Saturdays in the lower zones of Spire Tertius, pumped up through pipes that had been installed 3 centuries before I was born, and maintained by contractors who answered to administrators who'd never descended below level 50. The water tasted like rust and old metal. Sometimes it ran brown for the first 10 minutes. Sometimes it didn't come at all. And you'd wait by the communal taps with your containers and listen to the pipes rattle emptily, while neighbors argued about whose turn it was and whether someone up levels had diverted the flow again. I was 14 standard years when I first understood that water was power. My name was Tobias Venn. I lived with my father in a hab unit on level 189, deep enough that you couldn't see sky from the windows, high enough that we weren't drowning in the toxic runoff from the industrial sectors below. The unit was 6 meters by 4 meters, 2 sleeping alcoves, a waste recycler, a single heating element that worked when the power grid cooperated. My father worked the assembly lines in Manufacturum Sigma 7, 16-hour shifts building components for Imperial Guard equipment. He'd come home with his hands shaking from repetitive motion and chemical exposure, eat whatever protein paste I'd prepared, sleep for 6 hours, and return to the line. He died when I was 16. Equipment failure. A pressing mechanism malfunctioned, came down on his workstation while he was clearing a jam. The Manufacturum administrators logged it as operator error, which meant no compensation for the family, no death benefits, nothing but a corpse delivered to our hab unit in a sealed container with instructions for disposal. I burned his body in one of the communal incinerators on level 191, watching through the observation port as the flames reduced him to ash and bone fragments. The incinerator operator charged me 12 throne gelt for the service. I paid because refusing meant leaving the body in the hab unit to rot, and rotting corpses attracted vermin and drew enforcer attention. After my father died, I had 3 options: find work in the manufacturums like he had, join one of the sanctioned labor guilds that conscripted orphans for hazardous assignments, or find alternative means of survival. The manufacturums paid barely enough to afford food and water. The labor guilds had mortality rates above 60% in the first year. Alternative means seemed preferable. I started running packages for the Ash Kings in month 2 of my orphanhood. The Ash Kings controlled 6 blocks around the water distribution hub on level 188. They were small-scale operation. Maybe 30 members, mostly young men between 15 and 25 who'd found themselves outside the Imperial employment system and needed to eat. They ran protection schemes on the local merchants, controlled access to certain high-demand goods that came up from the black market networks in the Underhive, and maintained a careful balance with the Adeptus Arbites by never being quite troublesome enough to warrant serious attention. Running packages meant carrying sealed containers from one location to another without asking questions about contents. The pay was 15 throne gelt per run, triple what I could make in a day of manufacturum work. The risk was that if Arbites intercepted you, they'd either confiscate the package and beat you unconscious, or decide you warranted processing and ship you off to a penal colony. But I was 16, malnourished, looked younger than my age. Arbites tended to give warnings to children rather than waste processing resources. I ran packages for 8 months before I met Castor. He was 23 standard years. Tall in a way that seemed impossible given the nutritional deficiencies common to our levels. Later, I learned he'd spent his childhood up levels, in the administrative zones where families had regular access to real food instead of protein paste and corpse starch. His father had been a low-level administratum clerk who'd made the mistake of questioning a superior's accounting practices. The superior had arranged for the father's employment termination and blacklisting, which meant the family lost their up-level housing authorization and descended. Castor's father had handled the descent poorly, took the long drop from level 97 when Castor was 14. His mother followed 6 months later, though she chose chemical exit instead of gravity. Castor survived by being smart and ruthless in proportions that let him thrive where others starved. When I met him, he was second in command of the Ash Kings, managing logistics and territorial negotiations with neighboring gangs. He had a way of speaking that made you believe he understood systems beyond our immediate survival, that he saw patterns in the Hive's chaos, where others just saw random violence and scarcity. The first time he spoke to me directly was in a storage facility on level 187, after I'd delivered a package to one of the Ash King's distribution points. "You're Ven's boy," he said. "Not a question. I am. Your father worked Sigma 7. Pressing line. Yes. Equipment failure. Logged as operator error." I didn't respond. These were facts, not questions. The pressing mechanism that killed him had been flagged for maintenance 8 times in the previous month, Castor said. Manufacturer administration chose to defer maintenance to next quarter to reduce operational costs. Your father died because someone decided the cost of repairs exceeded the cost of replacing a worker. "I know," I said. "Do you?" He looked at me with a tension that felt different from the casual scrutiny most people offered. This was assessment, measurement. Most people know facts. Few people understand what the facts mean. Your father was killed by mathematics, by someone calculating his value and determining it was less than the value of a maintenance cycle. "What does it matter?" I asked. "He's dead." Understanding why doesn't change that. Understanding why, Castor said, is the difference between being a victim and being someone who ensures the mathematics work in your favor next time. He recruited me properly after that conversation. Not as a package runner, but as someone he was training for more complex work. He taught me how the water distribution system functioned, how the administratum allocated resources, where the pressure points were in the Hive's infrastructure. He taught me to see the Spire not as a vertical city, but as a machine with specific inputs and outputs that could be manipulated if you understood the mechanisms. The Ash Kings had been operating the same territory for 6 years when Castor decided it was time to expand. The gang's leadership, an older man named Drake, who'd founded the organization and ran it with cautious conservatism, resisted initially. Expansion meant conflict with neighboring gangs, which meant drawing Arbite's attention, which meant risking the sustainable operation they'd built. Castor spent 3 months convincing Drake that sustainability wasn't survival. The Spire was changing, population density increasing, resources tightening. Other gangs were consolidating. Either the Ash Kings grew, or they'd be absorbed by whoever grew faster. I watched Castor work on Drake during strategy sessions in the gang's primary facility, a converted storage space on level 188, where the leadership met to discuss operations. Castor never pushed directly. He presented information, casualty reports from territorial conflicts on other levels, resource flow analysis showing declining access to black market goods, population projections indicating increased competition for existing territory. "We control 6 blocks," Castor said during one session. "The Rust Vipers control 8. The Downward Brotherhood controls 12. We're the smallest of the major organizations in this sector. Small makes us vulnerable. If the Vipers decide our territory would improve their resource position, what stops them from taking it?" "The cost," Drake said. "We'd fight. They'd lose people. Not worth it for 6 blocks. Not worth it today," Castor agreed. "But what about next year? When water allocations decrease again and the blocks we control include the distribution hub, what about when the administratum increases tithes and their profit margins compress? Eventually, the mathematics favor aggression. When that happens, being small means being consumed." Drake authorized the expansion in year 3 of my association with the Ash Kings. We started with the Rust Vipers' southern territory, 4 blocks on level 187 that bordered our existing holdings. The approach was systematic. First, we offered the Vipers' street-level operators better pay to switch allegiance. 3 of them accepted. That gave us intelligence about the Vipers' patrol patterns and response capabilities. Second, we disrupted their protection rackets by offering merchants in their territory better rates and more reliable security. 7 merchants switched. Third, we waited until the Vipers responded, then hit their response teams with overwhelming force at times and locations we'd chosen. The Vipers lost 14 people in 6 weeks. We lost 3. After 6 weeks, the Vipers' leadership requested negotiation. Castor met with them in a neutral facility on level 185, accompanied by 4 Ash Kings, including myself. I was 18 by then, trained in enforcement work, trusted enough to stand security during leadership meetings. The negotiation lasted 40 minutes. The Vipers ceded the 4 blocks in exchange for guaranteed non-aggression in their remaining territory and a percentage of the revenue from protection operations in the disputed zone. Castor agreed. The territorial boundary shifted. We controlled 10 blocks now instead of 6. Drake celebrated the expansion as vindication of his leadership. Castor said nothing to contradict him, but I saw the calculation in his expression. This wasn't victory. This was proof of concept. We expanded 3 more times in the next 18 months, absorbing sections of territory from smaller gangs who couldn't match our organizational efficiency. By year 4, the Ash Kings controlled 23 blocks across levels 186 through 189 and employed over 200 people in various capacities. We weren't a street gang anymore. We were infrastructure. Castor became official leadership in year 5, after Drake died. The death was listed as cardiac failure, which was plausible. Drake was 47, had spent most of his life breathing toxic air and eating substandard nutrition. But the timing was convenient. Drake had been resisting Castor's proposal to move into water distribution control, arguing it would draw excessive Arbite's attention. I never asked Castor if he'd arranged Drake's death. The question felt irrelevant. Drake died. Castor assumed control. The organization continued operating more efficiently under centralized leadership. The mathematics favored the transition. Under Castor's leadership, we stopped being the Ash Kings. The name was too small for what we were becoming. Castor renamed the organization the Tertius Compact, which sounded less like a gang and more like a legitimate administrative body. He implemented formal structure, divisions for security, logistics, resource management, external relations. He established regular wages instead of percentage cuts. He created dispute resolution protocols so members didn't settle conflicts through violence that damaged operational efficiency. Most importantly, he moved us into water control. The water distribution hub on level 188 had always been part of our territory, but we'd treated it like any other asset. We protected it. We taxed the administrator who managed it. We ensured it kept functioning because our territory needed water. Castor saw different mathematics. Water was the fundamental resource. Everyone needed it. The administrative controlled the supply, but they controlled it inefficiently. Too many administrative layers, too much corruption, too little maintenance. The pipes leaked, the pumps failed. The allocation schedules were arbitrary and subject to manipulation by clerks accepting bribes. We could do better. The first step was removing the existing administrator, a man named Theron who'd held the position for 6 years and had developed comfortable arrangement with various gangs, accepting payments from each to maintain access. Castor offered Theron a choice: work for the Tertius Compact directly or retire immediately. Theron attempted to negotiate, suggesting he could maintain his existing arrangement while also cooperating with us. Castor repeated the choice. Theron retired. We installed our own administrator, a man named Marcus, who'd worked logistics for us and understood distribution systems. Marcus's first action was conducting comprehensive infrastructure assessment. He documented every leak, every failing pump, every bottleneck in the distribution network. The list required 18 pages. Castor allocated 20% of the compact's revenue to repairs. This was substantial investment, far more than any gang typically spent on infrastructure. But Castor explained the mathematics. Every liter of water we lost to leaks was value disappearing. Every pump failure meant angry residents who'd seek supply from alternative sources. By investing in the system's reliability, we increased both supply and customer satisfaction. The repairs took 4 months. We hired unlicensed tech adepts from the Hive who knew pipe systems and pump mechanisms, but weren't sanctioned by the Mechanicus. We replaced corroded sections. We installed backup systems. We established maintenance schedules. When the work was complete, water flow to levels 186 through 189 increased by 37%. The taps that had run dry on Tuesdays now worked reliably 6 days per week. The brown water that had required settling and filtering now ran mostly clear. The population noticed immediately. We started charging for water access in Year 6. Not officially, the administratum still theoretically controlled water allocation, still collected tithes related to resource distribution. But we collected our own fees, 10 throned gelt per household per month for reliable access. Households that paid received consistent service. Households that didn't pay discovered their building's water supply became intermittent, subject to mysterious pressure failures that coincided with payment delinquency. Enforcement was handled quietly. No violence required. Simple infrastructure manipulation. Close the valve that fed a particular building, wait for complaints, mention that households in compliance didn't experience such difficulties. Payment rates exceeded 90% within 2 months. The Arbites noticed our water operations but didn't intervene. This puzzled me initially. The Arbites existed to enforce Imperial law, and what we were doing clearly violated numerous regulations about resource allocation and unauthorized taxation. I asked Castor about it during a planning session in Year 6. They notice, he said. They don't care. There's a difference. Why don't they care? Because we're solving problems they can't solve. The administratum should maintain water infrastructure. They don't. They should ensure consistent supply. They don't. We do both. From the Arbites' perspective, we're reducing disorder, fewer complaints, fewer riots over water shortages, fewer deaths from dehydration and contaminated supply. We're making their jurisdiction more stable. So they're allowing us to operate. They're choosing not to allocate resources to stopping us, Castor corrected. The Arbites exist to maintain order, not to enforce every regulation. Order means keeping violence below certain thresholds and ensuring the population remains functional enough to provide tithes to the Imperium. As long as we contribute to those outcomes, we're not worth the effort of suppression. This was the principle that guided our expansion for the next 4 years. Provide stability, don't disrupt Imperial functions, stay below the threshold where suppression becomes more efficient than tolerance. We moved into food distribution in Year 7, using the same methodology we'd applied to water. Identify the existing system's inefficiencies, invest in improvements, establish reliable service, charge for access. We consolidated the 17 different merchants operating on our levels into a unified distribution network. We negotiated bulk purchasing agreements with Hive smugglers and up-level suppliers. We reduced prices by 12% while increasing our own profit margins by standardizing operations. The population noticed. Again, by Year 8, the Tertius Compact controlled 40 blocks across 5 Spire levels. We employed over 700 people. We managed water, food, waste disposal, and security services for a population exceeding 100,000. We were de facto government for our territory, more efficient and responsive than the official administrative presence. The Arbites still didn't intervene. The administrative still collected their tithes. We paid them from our revenue, on time, without complaint. From their perspective, nothing had changed except that their administrative burden had decreased. They no longer needed to manage infrastructure in our territory. We handled it. They simply collected payments. Castor explained this to me during the private conversation in Year 8, after I'd been promoted to his primary deputy. The Imperium doesn't care who manages the mechanisms. It cares that the mechanisms function. We make the mechanisms function better than the administratum did. Therefore, we're more valuable to the Imperium than the officials we've replaced. Eventually, they'll recognize this formally. You're expecting legitimization, I said. I'm expecting acknowledgement of reality. We control 5 levels. We maintain order, We collect and forward tithes. We've reduced Arbeit's incident reports in our territory by 48% compared to 5 years ago. What are we, if not effective governance? I didn't answer. The question was rhetorical. Castor already knew what we were. Criminals who'd become administrators by making ourselves more useful than the legitimate authorities. The transition felt inevitable at the time. Felt like natural progression. We'd started as a street gang running protection rackets. We'd evolved into territorial administrators managing infrastructure. The jump from that to formal recognition seemed like a small step, just paperwork acknowledging what everyone already understood. I didn't realize then that the transition would require sacrifice. That Castor understood from the beginning what it cost to move from criminal to legitimate, and had already calculated whether the cost was acceptable. I didn't realize that I was part of the calculation. The Downward Brotherhood controlled levels 183 through 185 when we began negotiating territory consolidation in Year 9. They were the largest remaining independent organization in our sector. Approximately 400 members, well armed, with established relationships with under-Hive smuggling networks and some up-level merchant guilds. Their leader was a man named Borean Kess, 42 standard years, who'd built the Brotherhood from a dozen street enforcers into a territorial power through careful expansion and strategic violence. Castor approached the consolidation as merger rather than conquest. He arranged a meeting with Kess in a neutral facility on level 184, bringing myself and 3 other senior compact members as security and witnesses. I was 23 by then, had been Castor's primary deputy for over a year, handled most operational decisions while Castor focused on strategic planning and external relations. The negotiation lasted 3 hours. Castor presented the mathematics. The Tertius Compact and Downward Brotherhood controlled adjacent territories, competed for the same resources, and maintained separate infrastructure systems that duplicated effort. Consolidation would eliminate redundancy, increase efficiency, and create a unified organization powerful enough to negotiate better terms with suppliers and resistant enough to deter external threats. Kess listened without interruption, then asked the question that mattered. Who leads the consolidated organization? Shared leadership initially, Castor said. You maintain authority over your existing operations and personnel. I maintain authority over mine. We coordinate on matters affecting both territories through joint council. After transition period, 12 months, we reassess structure based on operational outcomes. Reassess means you expect to assume full control, Kess said. Reassess means we evaluate which leadership model produces better results and adjust accordingly, Castor replied. If distributed authority proves more effective, we maintain it. If centralized authority proves more effective, we implement it. The organization's efficiency matters more than individual authority. This was partially truthful. Castor believed centralized authority was more efficient. He'd organized the entire compact around that principle. But he also understood that Kess wouldn't accept subordinate position immediately, and negotiating shared leadership now with expectation of transition later was more efficient than forcing confrontation. Kess agreed to the consolidation. The merger completed over 6 weeks, integrating the Brotherhood's personnel and operations into compact structure. We absorbed their security divisions, their distribution networks, their administrative personnel. The organization grew to over 1,100 members, managing 8 Spire levels, serving a population approaching 200,000. The joint leadership lasted 7 months. Kess died during an Arbeits raid on level 183 that targeted an illegal weapons cache. The raid was legitimate. The weapons cache existed, contained prohibited military-grade equipment that exceeded what gangs were permitted to maintain. But the raid's timing was suspicious. The cache had been there for over 2 years. Why had the Arbeits chosen that specific moment to act? I asked Castor about it 3 days after Kess died. We were alone in his personal quarters on level 187. He'd moved into a larger hab unit that functioned as both residence and private office. separated from the compact's operational facilities to allow for confidential planning. "Did you inform the Arbites about the cache?" I asked. Castor looked at me with the same assessment I'd seen years before when he first recruited me. Measuring, calculating. Yes, he said. Kess was cooperating. The merger was functioning. Kess was cooperating temporarily. He intended to rebuild his independent power base once he understood our operational methods well enough to replicate them. I observed him cultivating personal loyalty among former Brotherhood members, establishing separate communication channels, diverting resources to accounts outside unified oversight. He was preparing to split the organization. You could have confronted him directly. I could have initiated internal conflict that would have fractured the organization and destroyed 6 months of integration work, Casto said. Or I could have ensured the Arbites removed him while conducting legitimate law enforcement, which preserved organizational unity and eliminated the threat without internal violence. You killed him. I provided information to authorities about actual criminal activity. The Arbites chose to act on that information. Kess chose to maintain prohibited weapons. He died from his own choices. The logic was sound. The mathematics favored Castor's approach. But something in my processing felt resistant, like my understanding was catching on edges I couldn't smooth away. "We used to be what Kess was," I said. "Small gang operating outside the law. Now we're providing information to the Arbites to eliminate competition. When did we become this?" Castor stood and walked to the window that overlooked Zevel 187's main thoroughfare. From this height, you could see the infrastructure we'd built. The water distribution stations, the food supply centers, the security checkpoints where compact personnel maintained order. "We became this when we chose to build instead of just take," he said. "When we invested in infrastructure. When we made ourselves necessary to the population's survival. That transition required leaving behind the identity of criminals fighting the system and accepting the identity of administrators maintaining it. Kess never made that transition. He remained a criminal who happened to control territory. That's why he died, and we continue. The Imperium accepts us now because we function as they function," I said. "The Imperium accepts us because we're more efficient than they are at the specific function of managing these levels. We're an improvement to their system. That makes us legitimate regardless of how we originated." He returned to the desk and pulled out a data slate containing correspondence from the administrator. "The sector administrator has requested a meeting, formal meeting, in up-level facilities. They're prepared to discuss official recognition of compact authority over levels 183 through 190. Legitimization, acknowledgement of reality," Castor corrected. "We already control these levels. They're simply prepared to formalize that control in exchange for contractual obligations regarding tithe payments and order maintenance." The meeting with the administratum occurred 3 weeks later. Castor brought myself and 2 other senior members to the up-level administrative complex on level 47, where the air was clean and the architecture hadn't been allowed to decay into industrial grimness. The sector administrator was a man named Laurent Valdane, 63 standard years, who'd held his position for 2 decades and understood that administrative efficiency mattered more than administrative purity. Valdane spoke without pretense. "The Tertius Compact controls 8 Spire levels in my sector. You maintain infrastructure, collect taxes, enforce order, and forward Imperial tithes more reliably than the previous administrative arrangements. My superiors have reviewed the situation and determined that formalizing your authority is preferable to attempting to suppress it." "What are the terms?" Castor asked. "You become the sanctioned governing authority for levels 183 through 190. You maintain full operational control. You're responsible for infrastructure, security, resource distribution, and population management. In exchange, you guarantee tithe payments to the administrator at rates we'll specify in the contract. You guarantee order maintenance, keeping violence below acceptable thresholds, and ensuring the population remains productive. You guarantee cooperation with Arbites when they require access to your territory for Imperial law enforcement. And if we decline formalization, then you remain criminal organization operating outside Imperial law, and we allocate resources to suppression. The resources required would be substantial. You're well organized and well armed. But the Imperium has substantial resources. Eventually, you'd be dismantled. Accepting legitimization is more efficient for everyone. Castor reviewed the contract terms over the next week. The tithe rates were high but manageable. The order maintenance requirements were standards we were already meeting. The cooperation requirements with Arbites were vague enough to allow flexibility in implementation. The primary cost was symbolic. We'd be formally subordinate to the administratum, operating under their authority rather than in opposition to it. We'd be servants of the Imperium, I said when Castor showed me the contract. We've always been servants of the Imperium, Castor replied. Everyone in the Hive serves the Imperium's requirements. Workers in the manufactorums, administrators in the complexes, gangs in the Underhive. We all exist within the system. The only question is what position we occupy within it. This contract moves us from criminal position to legitimate position. Our function remains the same. Our authority increases. Your father questioned accounting practices in the administratum. They destroyed him for it. Castor's expression didn't change, but I saw something shift in his eyes. The first time I'd referenced his origin since he'd told me about it years before. My father questioned the system from a position of weakness, Castor said. He was a low-level clerk, with no leverage and no alternatives. They crushed him because they could, and because crushing him cost them nothing. We're different. We control 8 levels. We manage 200,000 people. We're operationally necessary. They can't crush us without significant cost. That's what legitimacy means. Not that they approve of us, but that removing us is more expensive than accepting us. The Tertius Compact accepted the administratum's terms. The formalization occurred in year 10. In a ceremony at the Sector Administrative Complex, where Castor signed documents establishing him as the sanctioned administrator of levels 183 through 190, Spire Tertius. The ceremony included representatives from the administratum, the Arbites, and the Mechanicus. They witnessed Castor's signature, filed the documents in official archives, and acknowledged his authority as legitimate extension of imperial governance. We'd transitioned from criminal gang to recognized government in 10 years. The population's daily experience didn't change. The same people collected water fees, distributed food, maintained security. But the legal status changed everything about our relationship with imperial authorities. Arbites who'd previously treated us as criminals now coordinated with us as fellow enforcement officials. Administratum clerks who'd previously ignored our existence now processed our reports and forwarded our tithe payments through official channels. Castor received a formal title, Administrator Castor Van. He'd adopted my surname during the legitimization process, claiming it honored his primary deputy and established continuity with the organization's earlier period. I understood the actual purpose, associating himself with my father's death with a narrative of worker crushed by administrative mathematics who'd been replaced by son who learned to manipulate the mathematics instead. The title came with privileges. Castor received housing authorization for up-level residents, though he declined it. Maintaining his quarters on level 187 kept him physically present in the territory he governed. He received increased resource allocations, priority access to administrative services, and most significantly, the authority to requisition Imperial Guard equipment for his security forces. The Compact's security division was armed with military-grade lasguns within 6 months of legitimization, equipped through official channels, blessed by Mechanicus tech priests, completely legal. We went from gang enforcers carrying improvised weapons to sanctioned security forces carrying the same equipment as the Imperial Guard. I was promoted to Chief Security Officer, commanding a division of 300 personnel responsible for maintaining order across 8 levels. My authority included detention powers, use of force authorization, and coordination with Arbeits on matters requiring their specialized capabilities. I'd started as a package runner, earning 15 throne geld per delivery. Now I commanded hundreds and drew salary that would have seemed impossible to my 16-year-old self. The first time I ordered lethal force against civilians occurred in year 11, month 4. A group of approximately 60 residents from level 189 organized a protest against increased water fees. The fees had risen by 20% in the previous quarter, necessary increase to fund infrastructure expansion into newly absorbed territory, but painful for population already operating on marginal resources. The protesters gathered at the main water distribution station, blocked access, demanded rollback to previous rates. I received notification of the situation while conducting routine inspection of security facilities on level 185. By the time I reached level 189, the protest had grown to over 200 people and had turned violent. Protesters had damaged distribution equipment and injured 3 compact personnel who'd attempted to disperse them. I arrived with 40 security personnel. The protesters were blocking the station entrance, preventing access for the thousands of residents who needed water but weren't participating in the protest. I ordered dispersal. The protesters refused, demanded negotiation. I explained that negotiation occurred through proper channels, petition submissions to the administrator's office, not infrastructure disruption. The protesters advanced toward our position. Some carried improvised weapons, metal bars, tools, pieces of equipment torn from the distribution station. I ordered warning shots. Security personnel fired into the air. The protesters continued advancing. I gave the order, suppress with lethal force authorized. The security personnel opened fire. The protesters weren't trained fighters, weren't prepared for actual violence. They broke immediately. 43 protesters died in the first volley. The remainder fled. The entire suppression lasted approximately 90 seconds. I remained at the distribution station for 6 hours afterward, directing cleanup, documenting casualties, filing reports. My hands were steady. My thought processes were clear. I'd given the order that killed 43 people, and I processed it as operational necessity. They disrupted essential infrastructure, threatened security personnel, refused lawful orders to disperse. The use of lethal force was authorized by my position and justified by circumstances. But underneath the clinical processing, something else registered. A thought that wouldn't quite surface into full consciousness. I'd killed my own people, not enemies, not external threats, residents of the territory I was supposed to protect. People who were desperate about water fees in the same hive where my father had died because maintenance costs were deemed too expensive. I reported to Castor that evening in his quarters. He reviewed my written report, asked clarifying questions about the timeline and decision-making process, then filed the report in official archives. "You executed your authority correctly," he said. "The protesters were disrupting essential infrastructure. Dispersal required force. You applied appropriate force." 43 people died protesting water fees, I said. 43 people died attempting to destroy infrastructure that serves 200,000. Their individual desperation doesn't justify collective harm. You protected the majority by suppressing the minority. That's the function of security forces. My father died because administrators calculated his value was less than maintenance costs, I said. Now I'm the administrator calculating that protesters' lives are less valuable than infrastructure protection. How is this different? Castor looked at me with an expression I couldn't quite pass. Not disapproval, not disappointment, something closer to recognition. "It's not different," he said. "You've become what we needed to become to survive and expand. Someone who makes the calculations. Someone who applies force when mathematics require it. This is what legitimacy costs. The ability to use imperial authority to kill imperial citizens when they threaten operational efficiency. I thought we were building something better than the system that killed my father. We built something more efficient. Efficiency isn't better in a moral sense. It's better in a functional sense. The system that killed your father was inefficient. Resources were wasted through poor maintenance and administrative incompetence. We don't waste resources. We invest in infrastructure, maintain equipment, provide reliable services. But when those services are threatened, we protect them with the same ruthlessness the Imperium applies everywhere. That's not a failure of our system. That's integration with the larger system we're part of. I went to my quarters after that conversation and sat in darkness for 3 hours. I'd killed 43 people. I would file a report that justified the killings through proper Imperial terminology. The administratum would review the report and find the use of force acceptable. The incident would be archived as routine security operation, and I would continue functioning as Chief Security Officer because the alternative was abandoning my position and accomplishing nothing except my own destruction. The thought that kept surfacing, that I couldn't suppress through clinical processing. My father had been crushed by administrators who calculated his death was acceptable cost. I'd become one of those administrators. I'd performed the calculation and ordered the deaths because the mathematics favored that choice. The system hadn't changed. I just moved to a different position within it. Year 12 brought additional territorial expansion. 2 neighboring sectors requested Tertius Compact administration after their own governing structures collapsed into violence and disorder. The administratum approved the requests. We'd proven ourselves capable, efficient, reliable in tithe payments. We absorbed levels 179 through 182 and levels 191 through 194. Expanding our territory to 12 Spire levels, serving over 300,000 people. The expansion required organizational restructuring. Castor divided the territory into 3 administrative districts, each managed by a district administrator reporting directly to him. I was assigned District 2, levels 185 through 189, while maintaining my Chief Security Officer position for the entire compact. The dual role meant 16-hour working days, constant travel between levels, endless meetings reviewing security reports, and resource allocation. I executed the role efficiently. I'd learned from Castor how to process large-scale administration, how to make decisions quickly using available data, how to delegate appropriately while maintaining oversight. The district I managed showed declining violence rates, increasing infrastructure reliability, and improving resource distribution efficiency. I was good at the work. I was becoming what Castor had been when I first met him. Someone who saw systems instead of people, who calculated resource allocation instead of feeling compassion for individual suffering. The second major use of force incident occurred in year 13, month 7. A disease outbreak on level 181 spread rapidly through the population, some kind of respiratory infection that the district medical officer identified as potentially pandemic, if not contained. Quarantine protocols required sealing the affected sections, preventing movement in or out until the infection either burned through the population or was suppressed through medical intervention. The affected sections held approximately 8,000 people. Sealing them meant those people couldn't access work, couldn't earn credits, couldn't purchase food from the distribution centers. It meant condemning them to starvation unless we diverted resources to provide support during quarantine. Castor reviewed the medical officer's recommendations and the resource calculations. Supporting 8,000 people through quarantine of unknown duration would cost approximately 12% of quarterly revenue. That cost would require reducing infrastructure investment or increasing fees across the entire territory. Seal the sections, Castor ordered. Provide minimal support, water only, no food supplies. Announce that residents can exit quarantine if they accept exile to the Underhive. Anyone who chooses to remain does so knowing support will be limited. Others will accept exile. Others will survive until the infection passes. But we can't allocate 12% of revenue to support people who aren't contributing productivity. The mathematics don't support it. We're condemning thousands to death. We're making the choice that preserves the organization's operational capacity. If we divert resources to support quarantine, we reduce infrastructure investment, which degrades services for the entire territory. The 300,000 people who aren't infected matter more than the 8,000 who are. You know this. You've made similar calculations. He was correct. I had made similar calculations. Every resource allocation decision involved choosing who received support and who didn't. Every security decision involved calculating acceptable casualties. I'd been making those calculations for years. But this felt different. This was deliberate choice to let thousands die by withholding support we could provide. Issue the order, Castor said. You're Chief Security Officer. The quarantine falls under Security Authority. I issued the order. The affected sections were sealed. Minimal support was provided. Over the next 6 weeks, approximately 4,200 people died, some from the infection, many from starvation, others from violence as desperate residents fought over limited resources. 3,000 accepted exile to the Underhive. The remainder survived until the infection burned out and quarantine lifted. The incident was documented in official reports as successful containment of pandemic threat. The administratum reviewed our handling and commended our efficiency. The casualty rates were deemed acceptable given the alternative of widespread infection. I processed the operation as I'd been trained to process everything, clinically, focusing on outcomes and resource efficiency rather than individual suffering. But something had fractured in my processing. Some capacity for moral evaluation that I'd been suppressing through years of administrative work had finally broken completely. I'd helped build a system that was more efficient than the previous administration. We provided better infrastructure, more reliable services, more consistent order. And we'd used that efficiency to make the same calculations the Imperium made everywhere, determining which lives were worth preserving and which were acceptable losses. We'd become what we'd replaced. We'd just done it more effectively. I requested private meeting with Castor in year 13, month 9. We met in his quarters late at evening, after the day's administrative work was completed. I want to discuss the moral framework we're operating under, I said. We operate under Imperial framework, Castor replied. We maintain order, provide services, collect tithes, and forward them to higher authority. The moral component is predetermined by the system we're part of. The system we built replicates those same mechanisms. We calculate human value in thrown guilt and resource allocation. We order deaths when the mathematics favor it. How is this better than what came before? It's more efficient. That's the only improvement we can provide within Imperial structure. We can't change the fundamental nature of the Imperium, that it consumes human life as fuel for its own perpetuation. We can only manage our small section of that machine with less waste than the previous managers. Is efficiency enough justification? Castor stood and walked to the window overlooking the territory we'd built. The view showed water stations, distribution centers, security checkpoints, all the infrastructure we'd invested in, all the systems we maintained. You're asking if our existence is morally justified, he said. The answer is no. Nothing in the Imperium is morally justified. The entire structure exists through constant violence against its own population. We participate in that violence. We've simply made ourselves skilled enough at administration that the violence we commit is organized, predictable, and efficient rather than chaotic and wasteful. Then why continue? Because the alternative is being crushed by someone else who'll commit the same violence less effectively. We're not heroes. We're not saviors. We're survivors who learned to manipulate the system instead of being destroyed by it. Your father died because he didn't understand that fundamental reality. We survive because we accepted it. I helped kill 43 people protesting water fees, I said. I helped kill 4,200 people by withholding support during quarantine. How many more deaths until I've replicated the exact crime that killed my father? You've already replicated it, Castor said quietly, multiple times. You became complicit the moment you accepted authority within this system. The question isn't whether you're morally compromised. You are. And so am I, and so is everyone who functions within Imperial structure. The question is whether you can continue functioning despite that knowledge. I didn't answer immediately. The question was genuine. Could I continue functioning as Chief Security Officer and District Administrator, knowing that my function required calculating acceptable casualties and ordering deaths when mathematics demanded it? The honest answer was yes. I could continue. I'd learned to process horrible decisions as administrative necessity. My capacity for moral resistance had eroded through years of progressive compromise. I'd become precisely what the system required. An efficient administrator who made ruthless calculations without emotional interference. "I'll continue," I said. "I know," Castor replied. "You wouldn't have built what you've built if you were capable of stopping now. We're both too integrated into the system to extract ourselves. We continue because continuing is what we've optimized ourselves to do." Year 14 brought formal nobility. The sector administrator recommended Castor for minor noble title in recognition of exceptional administrative performance. The recommendation was approved by higher authority. Castor was granted hereditary title, Lord Administrator of the Tertius Territories, with all associated privileges and responsibilities. The ceremony occurred in the planetary capital, in administrative facilities I'd never accessed before. Castor brought myself and 3 other senior compact administrators as witnesses. An Imperial official whose title I didn't fully understand placed a seal ring on Castor's hand and spoke words about service to the Emperor and recognition of merit. Castor had started as an orphaned boy whose father jumped from level 97 rather than face poverty. Now he was noble. Criminal gang leader had become sanctioned administrator, had become recognized aristocrat through progressive legitimization. The Imperium had accepted us completely. We'd proven ourselves more useful than the authorities we'd replaced. Our criminal origins didn't matter. Our violent methods didn't matter. Only our efficiency mattered. And we demonstrated efficiency sufficient to warrant formal incorporation into Imperial hierarchy. We'd won. We'd achieved everything Castor had calculated toward for 14 years. And I felt nothing except hollow recognition that winning meant becoming indistinguishable from the system we'd originally existed outside of. Castor died in year 16. He was 39 standard years old. Medical analysis indicated cardiac failure, the same cause that had killed Drake years before. The timing was less suspicious this time. Castor had been working 18-hour days for over a decade, consuming minimal nutrition, breathing Hive air that degraded respiratory and cardiovascular function. His body simply failed. I was with him when he died. We were reviewing quarterly reports in his quarters when he stopped speaking mid-sentence. His expression changed. Not pain exactly, more like confusion. He looked at me and said, "Something's wrong." Then he collapsed. I called for medical personnel immediately. They arrived within 4 minutes. They attempted intervention, stimulants, cardiac manipulation, various procedures I didn't fully understand. Nothing worked. Castor died on the floor of his quarters while 3 medical specialists worked on his body, and I stood watching, unable to assist, unable to prevent. The medical personnel continued their efforts for 18 minutes after I could see he was already dead. Finally, the senior specialist looked at me and said, "He's gone. I'm sorry." I remained in the quarters for 3 hours after they removed his body. I sat in the chair where I'd sat thousands of times during meetings with Castor, and I tried to process what his death meant. He'd been my mentor, my commander, my primary connection to purpose for 14 years. He taught me how to see systems instead of people, how to calculate efficiently, how to survive by making myself useful to structures larger than individual life. He transformed me from orphaned runner into chief security officer and district administrator. And now he was dead, killed by the same grinding attrition that killed everyone in the Hive eventually, worked to exhaustion maintaining systems that didn't value individual survival. The Compact's senior leadership met the following day to discuss succession. The organizational structure Castor had built required centralized authority. Someone had to make final decisions on resource allocation, territorial strategy, and external relations. The 3 district administrators and 5 division directors each had operational authority in their domains, but the Lord Administrator position needed to be filled. They offered it to me. The vote was unanimous. I'd been Castor's deputy for years, understood his strategic thinking, had proven myself capable through my district's performance. The transition would be smooth if I accepted. "You'd become Lord Administrator Tobias Venn," the senior legal advisor explained. "The noble title is hereditary to Castor's line, but you'd inherit his administrative authority over the Tertius territories. The administratum would likely confirm your appointment and potentially grant separate noble recognition once you've demonstrated continued performance." I would become what Castor had been. Criminal boy who'd learned to manipulate systems would transition into sanctioned noble managing 12 Spire levels and 300,000 people. The cycle would continue. Someone new would join the organization, learn administration from me the way I'd learned from Castor, eventually replace me when I died from overwork or violence or simple attrition. The system perpetuated itself through progressive consumption of individuals who proved useful enough to be promoted rather than discarded. "I accept," I said. I became Lord Administrator 3 weeks after Castor died, in a ceremony at the Sector Administrative Complex. The same Imperial official who'd recognized Castor placed a different seal ring on my hand. Not noble title yet, just administrative authority. He spoke words about continuity of governance and recognition of merit. I looked at the assembled witnesses, administrative officials, Arbeits commanders, Mechanicus representatives, and understood that they saw me as success story. Boy from level 189 who'd risen through capability and determination to position of legitimate authority. Proof that the imperial system rewarded merit. They didn't see the 43 protesters I'd killed. They didn't see the 4,200 quarantine victims I'd let starve. They didn't see my father crushed by pressing mechanism because maintenance costs were deemed too expensive. They just saw efficient administrator who maintained order and forwarded tithes reliably. I've served as Lord Administrator for 11 years now. I'm 38 standard years old. I manage 12 Spire levels through 3 district administrators and multiple division directors. I've maintained the infrastructure investments Castor initiated, expanded into 2 additional levels, and reduced violence rates to historic lows. The administratum has commended my performance repeatedly. I'll likely receive formal noble title within 5 years if current trends continue. The territory I govern has water that runs 6 days per week, mostly clear. Food distribution is reliable and affordable by Hive standards. Security forces maintain order without excessive violence. The population's daily existence is measurably better than it was 27 years ago when I was running packages for the Ash Kings. And I kill people regularly. Not personally. I order deaths through security forces who execute my authority. Protesters who disrupt infrastructure. Criminals who threaten order. Residents who become economically non-viable during resource shortages. I calculate acceptable casualties and issue orders and file reports justifying the decisions. I've become what killed my father. I'm the administrator who calculates human value in throne gelt and resource allocation, who determines which lives are worth preserving and which are acceptable losses. The difference between me and the administrators who killed my father is that I'm more efficient. I maintain infrastructure better. I waste fewer resources through corruption and incompetence. I kill people for operational reasons instead of negligent ones. This is what success looks like in the Imperium. This is what rising from level 189 to Lord Administrator means. You learn to make the calculations. You learn to process horror as administrative necessity. You learn to become the mechanism that crushes others, the way mechanisms once crushed you. The Imperium doesn't change. It just promotes the survivors who learn to operate its machinery most effectively. I sit in my quarters on level 187, the same quarters Castor occupied, and I review quarterly reports showing infrastructure performance, security incident statistics, tithe payment schedules. The numbers indicate operational success. The territory functions efficiently. The population is stable. The system perpetuates itself. And I remember the taste of rust in the water that came on Tuesdays and Saturdays, back when I was 14 and didn't understand yet that water was power. I remember my father's hands shaking from chemical exposure. I remember Castor explaining that my father died because someone calculated his value was less than maintenance costs. I remember believing we'd build something better. We built something more efficient. We replaced chaotic violence with organized violence. We replaced wasteful administration with effective administration. We proved ourselves useful enough to be legitimized. Crime was rewarded with power because crime performed the system's functions better than legitimate authority had. The Imperium accepted what worked. We worked. Therefore, we were absorbed into the Imperium's eternal machinery, grinding forward, consuming the people we were supposed to protect, perpetuating the exact mechanisms that created us. I am Lord Administrator Tobias Venn. I control 12 Spire levels. I've killed thousands through direct orders and administrative decisions. I will continue killing thousands more as long as I maintain this position. The system doesn't require my approval. It just requires my function. And I function efficiently. That's all that matters in the Imperium. That's all that's ever mattered. The water runs 6 days per week now, mostly clear. My father would have appreciated that, I think.